Hi, this is my YouTube channel, What's Wrong with the World and How to Fix It. I'm Dr. Terry Lay. The subtitle of the channel is History, Human Nature and Society Today. I'm interested in looking at some of the deeper issues which lie behind some of our current problems, and my background's in sociology, so I'm talking about typical sociological topics, but also topics of general interest. Times. So patriarchy is a very interesting topic for sociologists, obviously. To give an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to say that patriarchy is actually cross-cultural and trans-historical, meaning that it's occurred in different periods of history, and it's also in different types of cultures, different locations in class and so on. It's a regime of male power and exploitation of women. And in that sense, it's an inequality. It's socially constructed to an extent in the sense that men kind of choose to create patriarchy and construct it politically by various actions, whether they're intended, conscious or not, but they act to create patriarchy. In that sense, it's socially constructed. It's also socially constructed in the sense that it's really different in different societies. So we could probably talk about patriarchies rather than patriarchy, but we use the term patriarchy to reflect the fact that it's a cross-cultural phenomenon and that it has similar features in different types of societies. But as well as being socially constructed, patriarchy is also something which depends upon the biological differences between the sexes. That it doesn't, it's causally dependent upon these differences. It couldn't exist without them, and it constantly and never-endingly depends upon. That's why patriarchy has been recreated in such different situations. It's pretty well universal in human societies. I mean, it's debatable how universal it is, but it's certainly extremely common, in which case you have to ask yourself the question is, why is it so common, even if it's not totally universal? So I'm happy to leave that question up in the air. I don't really care about that, just that I think it's important to acknowledge how common it is. I think patriarchy is not inevitable at the present time. I think it can be defeated and is being rolled back as we speak, and it has been since the second half of the 19th century. And that rollback depends upon certain technological capacities that have come with modernity and industrialism. So this is all pretty controversial stuff, really. I mean, okay, let me just talk about some of the views of patriarchy, which I think are completely mistaken. Okay, so one, the kind of conservative line is there's no such thing as patriarchy. In other words, men don't have power, women choose a different role from men, and these roles are complementary. I just think that's completely wrong. The difference, another conservative theory is that differences in gender roles come from differences in temperament and intellect, like that women are not good at maths, or men are more aggressive, or something like that. I also think that's completely wrong, that it's all related to testosterone and whatever. I think just the evidence doesn't really back it up, basically. Another kind of view is that that's much more common on the left at the moment, is that gender is socially constructed completely without any reference to biology, like totally independently of biology. Also think that's wrong. Another view on the left, which is very common, is that patriarchy comes out of class society. It's all connected would be a classic term used to announce this point of view, like capitalism, patriarchy, racism, environmental destruction, they're all part of the same package. No, they're not actually. Patriarchy is pretty well an independent phenomenon which grafts onto and kind of becomes part of various other social structures and social regimes. Another view that I would like to challenge on the left is that feminism, or the critique of patriarchy is relevant to Western culture, but not really applicable to other cultures which don't have a kind of liberalism or a feminist movement or the Enlightenment or whatever that the concern with gender, gender roles and so on is something which is specific to Western society, and then so consequently the term patriarchy is inapplicable in other societies. I'm going to argue that's not the case and explain why. And finally, the idea that feminism is not about equality. So talking about patriarchy as a form of inequality between men and women must be mistaken, because who wants to be like men? Like, in other words, why would women want to be like men? I think the term inequality doesn't imply sameness. It doesn't imply that the goal is sameness. It just implies that the goal is an equality of power, a lack of exploitation, and so forth. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the idea that patriarchy is a kind of exploitation. What does that mean? Okay, so my kind of viewpoint, and like, you won't find this in many sociology textbooks, is that the term exploitation has a meaning because we presuppose various innate basic drives of human nature. And that in that context, we say that what exploitation is what takes place when one person is getting their basic desires met at the expense of things that the other person is doing which kind of frustrate their basic desires. So it's like an unfair transaction. One party is getting, like using philosophers' language, A is getting more out of this transaction than B is getting out of it. And B is getting frustrations of their basic desires, and A is getting their basic desires satisfied. Okay, so that seems, now, to back that up, I need to talk again, and I'll just mention, because I've discussed this in previous videos, what are the drives of human nature in terms of which patriarchal exploitation can be understood. Okay, so hunger, the desire for food. So go back to earlier videos if you haven't heard about this. Physical comfort and health is the second one. Social pleasures, loving, the pleasure of giving social pleasure to other people, loving people, and being loved. Status appreciation, like people think what you're doing is important or useful or whatever. Good company, like having fun with friends and so on. These are social pleasures. Sexual desires, and I won't go into that. I discussed this more detail before. Creativity, exciting and interesting work, the excitement of, the adrenaline rush that comes with doing something exciting and so on, as well as the sort of pleasure of making a great work of art or whatever. Autonomy, getting what you want, like at any particular time. I take that as a basic desire of human nature. And of course it inflects other things. So, like my favorite example is, what's a good meal? Okay, so a good meal satisfies the basic desire of hunger, but it also, in terms of autonomy, has to be the kind of meal that you actually want. And that's very socially located, what kind of meal is regarded as satisfying. Now, you may say that it's really implausible to define inequality in terms of this list of desires. Like, for example, how could you compare the pleasure of taking a walk in the park with the pleasure of playing a computer game? You'd obviously have different people saying one thing and saying the other about that example. And so if patriarchy is to be defined as exploitation, men exploit women, meaning that men get more of their basic desires than women, how can you possibly analyze that? Because, desires are very different and variable. The expression of all these 6 key desires is massively unique and culturally constructed and unique to individual people and so on. And how are you going to make this comparison? My answer to that is just this. First of all, I think that's what the term exploitation implies, even if it's very hard to nail down particular cases. So we can't escape from doing this. That might be my first point. My second point would be this, that when we look at structures of exploitation in society that we're interested in, like racism, gender inequality, social class, and so on, it's not that hard. And the reason it's not that hard is that the ruling group gets more of their desires met across this whole panel of basic human desires, and in a whole lot of different ways and instances which we can name. And so it doesn't become that hard. It may be impossible to quantify this exploitation, but it's certainly not that hard to describe it. And that's what I'll be doing in the next section. So I'm going to start off with Anne Oakley, The Sociology of Housework. Not that, you know, like it's the obvious thing for a sociologist to do is to look at a white Western metropole country like London, you know, and a white anthropologist who happens to be a feminist sociologist or whatever, Anne Oakley. And all I'd say about that is, yeah, that's a fair comment. But I will be talking about other societies and cultures later on, probably in the next YouTube. So she's looking at the discontents of 40 London housewives, and so she interviews these 40 London housewives. So these are people whose husbands are working, like they've got full-time jobs. This is in the 70s, before neoliberalism really kind of went kabang, and she's interviewing them about what they're doing is they're staying home, and she finds out that they're working like a 70-hour week, you know, like compared to their husbands who are working maybe a 40-hour week with another, like throw in another 10 hours for transport or something like that. So they're working longer hours than their husbands. And they've got children under 5, you know, like the worst, you know, the most difficult. And also, of course, the term housewives implies that they're living in separated family residential units pretty well with nobody else there. You know, they're not living in extended families with grandparents and lots of kiddies running about and brothers and sisters all living in under the same roof or anything like that. So they're fairly isolated. Okay, so let's look at this situation. Okay, so the first thing is that in terms of creativity, they find housework boring and monotonous and long hours of work. Like, for example, they talk about how boring ironing is, or how, you know, you clean a room and then everyone comes home and the next day you've got to just bloody clean it again, and it's just terrible. And a lot of these London housewives, as you'd expect, would have had earlier jobs, and there's a good range of classes. So some have had work, even like factory jobs, which are mind-numbingly boring, and they say even these jobs are more interesting than doing housework. And they're obviously comparing, and they do compare their own work with that of their husbands, and they say, okay, their husbands, it's no picnic being employed, you know, like in the various jobs that their husbands have got, but it's a slightly more interesting work than what they're doing. This would be their point. In terms of sociability, all right, so they talk about the low status of the housewife, and like I said in another talk on YouTube, you know, they compare themselves to, they say that people think of them as a cabbage when they're a housewife. And they talk about the fact that the husbands don't appreciate their work. So this is a failure of social pleasures, in the sense they're not getting appreciation for the work they do. You know, he comes home, he doesn't even notice what I've done, you know, that kind of thing. And loneliness is a huge thing. Like, I think, as I might have said in another talk, like they go, you know, it's really exciting when the milkman comes around, you know, or, you know, I spend the whole day at home by myself. It's massive. I feel really lonely, and it's such a, you know, I'm so excited when my husband gets back from work, or you know, like every week I might go and see my mother in another suburb or something like that, and you know, like, this is a real pleasure, and so on. So it's very lonely. The social pleasures are diminished. Autonomy. Well, clearly one of the advantages in terms of autonomy in housework is that you choose your own work. But what Oakley points out, and what they balance this against, is the sense of particular tasks of housework feel obligatory. You know, like, you have to make the bed. You know, if the kitchen is covered in sand and dog hair, you have to vacuum it. And they feel this as a sort of obligation. This is obligatory work. They don't find it unconstrained. Oh, you might do so, oh, you might not. No, far from that. If the baby's nappy needs changing, God, Jesus, you have to do that, you know, and so on and so forth. Okay. It's unpaid work. I mean, this is like the elephant in the room, obviously, because what their husbands are doing in their jobs is getting paid for their work, whereas the wives are not getting paid. Now, you could say, well, the family is sharing their income and so on, but from a sort of moral point of view and a legal point of view, the husband feels like, I've worked and I've earned my money, and it's my money. And there are a lot of cases where this is really obvious in the way households behave. You know, like the husband goes out and buys toys of like a family that I know about. The husband goes out and buys a huge boat that he hardly ever uses, and the wife has nothing like that. You know, like an old bomb car or whatever. So this autonomy is real, and it's also real in the sense if the couple splits up, women are much more likely to be dependent, you know, like, to be on the dole or welfare, or, you know, supporting mother's benefit, or not to have a job that pays as well as their husbands. I mean, all of these things are relevant. They're constrained in their work by the fact that they've got kiddies and all that. So why is this autonomy? Well, basically what money does is it gives you autonomy. It means you can pay money to get what you want at any particular time, because you're accessing the labor of other people who've worked, and those goods have been put on the market and you're buying them. So in terms of human desires, money provides autonomy. Now that's what you don't get with housework. And we can look at this in terms of the life course that women are getting. Like in the statistics that I've looked at most recently, it's like something like between 45 and 50% of men's earnings over the whole life course. You know, so if we take into account retirement, superannuation, social welfare checks, you know, like men's work, women's times out of the labor force, women's lower pay than men. We put all this together and add all of this up. Women are earning 45% of men's total earnings in their life course. Now that is a massive dependence, and there's no way to get around that. And it's reflected in all sorts of ways in men's power, in the sense that they have power over women because of this extra autonomy they're getting through their wages. And one of the other things that Oakley's interviewees talk about is the authority and power of the husbands to make decisions. So the husbands are likely to come home and complain if the housework isn't up to their standards. They're, you know, like, again, from my own you know, family stuff and friends and so on. You know, a husband who gets the shits with the dinner and throws the plate of food at the wall. You know, like, that's an appalling thing to do. But basically it's a complaint about housework, and it's an expression of rage and anger, and it's somewhat terrifying, you know, like, it's scary. And so in terms of physical well-being and comfort, it's basically scary. In terms of autonomy, it means that the wife's cooking is, you know, she has to adjust her standards to what the husband wants. In terms of status and appreciation, well, you can't think of anything worse, and so on and so forth. But then it's also in more consensual decisions. Like in Oakley's research, quite a few of the women talked about the fact that their husbands were effectively deciding how many children the couple would have. Oh, he thinks we shouldn't have any more, so I'm not having any more, even though I'd like another one, you know, all that kind of stuff. Or he thinks we should have 5 and I only want 2, you know, all of that. Okay. So this is a massively convincing picture of inequality and exploitation, in the sense that the work that the housewives are doing, like their 70 hours of work, is contributing to the kind of lifestyle that the couple can live together, and to the husband's lifestyle, and that he's not doing an equivalent of amount of work for her. Even if you take his paid job as work, he's not working as many hours of that. And in the paid work that he's doing, he's getting more pleasures out of that than she's getting out of her housework. So there's an inequality of pleasures here. The wife's giving the husband more, and she's getting back. She's getting lots of frustrations compared with the pleasures he's getting out of her housework and stuff. Now, let's go back to the sort of old conservative thing. Women want their role and so on. Is the role of the housewife wanted? Well, what Oakley found was that, like, you know, a huge percentage of the women thought that the role of the wife was to become a housewife and to do this housework. They wouldn't want their husbands doing it. And they'd say things like, I don't like a man to be henpecked. And and I think a man should be a man, you know, like, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, this was in the 70s, but I'm sure it's not that different. I mean, the language might be a bit different, but the sentiment's probably not entirely changed. So in that sense, it's fair to say, as conservatives do, that women want their role. They want the housewife role. And like in the terms of sociology, we could see this as an ideology, you know, like, in other words, the powerless group is having various ideas and so on, which actually support the continued power of the ruling group. And there are various ways in which this comes about, which I won't talk about now. But let's look at other aspects of autonomy here, which kind of balance that issue. Yeah, it provides the lack of autonomy, which I've talked about in housework, the sense of having to do housework, and the lack of autonomy in the relationship that comes about through the housewife role in comparison to the role of paid work, the husband's wage, and so on. The housewife provides services for a husband who endures less frustration of his desires in his services for the family. There's a difference in hours of obligatory work in the sense that, especially with kids under 5, women really are doing a 70-hour working week compared with men's work. And of course, the main thing is the difference of autonomy achieved through the wage. The husband's got a huge amount of autonomy compared with the wageless housewife. And it amounts to an exploitation of the overall balance of transactions, autonomy being just one part of these transactions for the couple. So that's one of the ways in which the feminist movement escapes from some of the problems, if you like, of liberal choice theory. You know, like, okay, oh, she chooses that role, so there can't be any exploitation. They say, no, let's look at the various basic desires of human beings, you know, autonomy, sociability, creativity, and so on, as 3 key desires, and go, well, let's look at how this is working out in terms of the housewife. And this feminist research, you know, like, in a sense, pioneers this kind of view of inequality and this analysis of it. And Oakley's study is obviously a part of the second wave of patriarchy. The second wave feminist picture of patriarchy. And like, there were lots of other studies in looking at other particular aspects, which I'll just mention. These are all looking at rich world contexts, but they're pretty well cross-class in the sense that the things I'm about to identify take place across different social classes. They're not just restricted to the middle class or something like that. Feminism in that sense is not just a middle class complaint. For example, there were studies of the situation in working places, which talk about how the jobs that women have when they are working, doing paid work, mean that they're sort of stuck in the one place all the time. They don't move about the place a lot like the men do in their work. And they have, the men in the work have more authority and they have more a status in the working place than the women. So this doesn't matter what sort of class location you're looking at. This sort of stuff's still going on. Other studies by this second wave feminist movement look at sexual pleasure in heterosexual relationships, like the Height Report. They look at assault and violence in relationship to issues of human nature, such as sexual desire, you know, not getting what you want sexually, autonomy, being, you know, forced to do things you don't want to do, sociability, being, you know, like being assaulted is a massively demeaning and stigmatizing event, and not to mention physical well-being and health and so on, long-term psychological damage, whatever. So, and obviously these things have been brought to the fore recently by the Me Too movement. Power over political life and public decisions. I mean, the fact is that armies and governments are all controlled by men in almost every case, and the appearance of women. I mean, this is changing a bit with the feminist movement, but clearly, if we're looking at patriarchy as a global phenomenon over time, we'd have to say this is a really typical pattern, which is only now starting to shift a little bit. Like now with the Australian Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, starting to think, oh, you know what, maybe we should have quotas for women in Parliament and stuff. Well, bloody well about time. The low status of women women's position in society, in terms of the theory of human nature, equates to a lack of social pleasure, that they're not getting status and appreciation for what they do. These things have less status, you know, like doing the housework has a lot less status than being out there constructing a house, you know, and building a brick wall, or even tiling a roof, or you know, like, excuse me, okay. I mean, this is to choose the men's positions that are really working class positions, not to even look at the middle class men. There's a whole lot of body language stuff about gender relationships, which you start to notice if you've got this kind of critical gaze of the feminist movement. One is, like, you know, men take up more space. So the key place to look for that is in public transport, where men sit with their legs apart, women sit with their legs crossed. Women often put a handbag on their lap. Men are likely to spread out, you know, like this in the chair and take up space. Yeah, and some women now just kick them in the shins. Very, very understandable. And so that's an example of body language which conveys power, authority. So in a sense, we have a repertoire of bodily behaviours which are innate, and we use them to express power differences. And that's an example of that. And that feminists have studied that, and they've taken lots of pictures of people and showed how this actually operates in practice. One thing I mean, here's two examples from going out at night. Okay, one thing is, if you go out at night to a mixed sex venue, you know, like, you know, a local bar or something like that, and it's after 10 o'clock, you'd be lucky to find a majority, you know, like an equal number of women there. And the women that you do find, like, no, this is not entirely true, obviously, but a lot of the women are a lot more of the women are in couples. You'll find a lot more men by themselves. So in a sense, there's a slight curfew on women. You know, it's not safe to be out after dark, especially not by yourself. It's safer to be out with a gang of girls and stay with them until you all get home, or, you know, or with a gang of boys that you know, like, or with a boyfriend and so on. It's safer. It's not, well, you know, this is like a curfew in terms of body language. What is this saying about women's power and authority in terms of women's options in society and so on? And here's another one. Okay, so if looking at a romantic couple and they're sitting at a table chatting to each other, like, okay, I mean, like 7 times out of 10, he's raving on, like mansplaining, not to put too fine a point on it, and she's listening attentively and nodding and going, you know, and it's like, you just look at that and you go, yeah, well, there you go. Okay, so that's the end of the talk, this particular talk. And the next time I'm talking about is the analysis of patriarchy, which I've developed in this, looking at the first world and rich countries, relevant to other times and places, right? And also to other cultures that are not part of the rich metropole of modern global Western culture and so on. So I'll be doing that in my next video. So look forward to it. This is on, what's it called? Test Cuts Loose. You. Okay. See you. And yeah,